Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. This is Linda from Sleep Tight Consultants, and she is a sleep consultant for families. Linda, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about your background?
So I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I am trained as a sleep consultant through Kim West, who people know of as the Sleep Lady. So I'm part of her gentle sleep coaching program. And I trained with her, I think about 12 years ago. So I've been doing this for a while, and it actually grew out of my experience running the New Moms group that I run. So I run a program called the Chicago New Moms Group that I started in January of 2011. And when I started running the group, I also started working with some of the families who the moms were in my group. And then from there, realized very quickly that I needed more tools. I needed a community of support. So that's when I trained with Kim. And I, have been working with families ever since then. I work with families all over the world. So I live in Chicago, but it doesn't matter where you live. That's the beauty of technology. And I work with roughly 200 children a year. So there are a lot of people out there that were sleepless and are no longer. And it's great. Most of the kids I work with are 4 months old through most of the time 6 years old. I am actually trained to work with children up until 10 years old, but more often it's under 6.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so take us back a little bit. I met you many, many years ago, and I don't even know how or why, or we were in something New Mom related, I think. So tell us a little bit about your New Moms group and why you started that and what that looks like when you do get together with these moms. Sort of what do you guys talk about? What does that sort of program look like?
Yeah. So the New Moms group really grew out of my experience after my daughter was born. And so anybody who's been in group has heard me say this. Just like any other new mom, I had no idea what had hit me. I felt like I was crazy. I thought, like, what have I done? This was way harder than I could have imagined it would possibly be. I felt completely unprepared for the experience. And my daughter's 18 and a half actually now at this point. And
Crazy.
so it's really interesting because I think back to that time, and it's not like we didn't have information, but that was really very much at the early end of social media. I wasn't actually on social media at that point. I don't even think I was on Facebook until I feel like my son was born. So then that was even another like 3 years later. And so I was very isolated. I mean, I certainly had friends, but most of my friends didn't have children. And we were living in New York City. I was working in an HIV program. Most of my coworkers were gay men. They were all like, what did you do to your life? So like a fun Saturday night is now a trip to the CVS. I get it. Cool. So
true.
it was like just a huge transition. And I found a group in my neighborhood when she was probably about 8 weeks old. And I still to this day remember how much relief I felt just hearing from those other moms that they were going through the same things that I was. I was like, oh, these are my people. This is where they are. And I really took from that experience, like this needs to be available. We need to talk to other moms. We need to share this experience and understand that we're not alone in it. And so then fast forward several years later, I had a son. Then he was, I think, around 2. And I was like, okay, now I can do this. And so I actually consulted with a lot of other groups that are similar to what I do now. I consulted with the one who ran the group that I was in. There's an amazing program in Washington, D.C. called Pace Moms. I consulted with them and pulled together essentially a curriculum for the group as it exists now. Of course, it's changed over the last 13 years. So the sessions are 6 weeks for new moms. I also now run a second time mom session that I started in 2018. And those sessions are 4 weeks. And the new mom session really, I think of it as kind of, at least in the beginning of it, the beginning of a 6-week session is sort of like the deer in the headlights experience where moms walk in and they're like, what do I do? Like I made it out of the house,
Yeah. That's
accomplished.
the first step.
Exactly, which is a huge first step for sure. And then, it's so interesting to see as the weeks progress how much more confident they appear, how much more confident they feel. They're, walking in is just really a different person. And then the contrast between them and the second time moms, which I just had the session finished yesterday and was commenting to one of them who, like, they walk in, like, baby's in a carrier, maybe they have a bag, maybe they forgot it at home and they're like, oh, it's fine, someone will lend me a diaper. Like, totally. Yeah, exactly. It's just such a difference. But in that new mom session, we're spending a lot of time in the beginning just talking about that transition to motherhood, what that's like, what sorts of things have felt challenging, what, was totally unexpected, things like feeding and sleeping and, what do you do when they're fussy and how do you get through the witching hour, those sorts of things. Yeah. Then we start talking more as the weeks go on about relationships, changes in your relationship with your partner, because, so many of us go from a relationship where we feel like things are pretty equitable to, wait a second, why am I doing all of the like traditional mom woman things? And that was never how I saw my relationship before. So navigating that.
That's such a good point too, because it's almost like a natural progression that you don't even mean to or want to fall into.
Right. And also so many of us kind of think of we have different expectations of our partner than maybe our mothers had of our fathers or our partners' mothers had of their fathers. So we're asking our partner to be a different type of parent than they have a model for. And so how do you create that experience in your home? What do you want that to look like? And how do you communicate that without being that nagging wife?
Yeah.
So we talk about that.
It's balance.
Absolutely. We talk about sleep, and I do a session on what is normal for sleep for babies in the newborn period, because of course these moms are being bombarded with so much information, just, everything out there on Instagram, on the internet in general. They're being told what they're doing wrong, and they try to normalize that early experience. And also, help them understand that it's going to get better. We then definitely talk about sleep training, what that truly looks like. And then I talk about development, also about starting solids in the context of development, because that's another thing that's confusing as babies are getting older. And then we talk about the transition back to work if they're going back, which many at this point are.
Yeah, especially in Chicago, in a city. I mean, a lot of people are going back to work. Yeah. That's amazing. Do you find that now, because your kids are older, like mine, that you have these conversations with these new moms? And I guess, what is the difference, would you say, between when you were a new mom and what new moms are like now? Because to your point about social media, I remember when I had my first, and he's almost 18, and I remember I didn't have a smartphone. Like I wasn't on, I don't even know if there was social media. I guess there was probably Facebook, but I definitely wasn't on it because I didn't even know what it was. So what are you seeing now, sort of the difference? Because sometimes when I work with new moms, which I do all the time, I'm like, and I forget that I'm actually a lot older than these people, because I just always feel like I'm the same age no matter what. But what do you see the difference between when you were a new mom versus the new moms now?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's funny because I think if I didn't spend so much time talking to moms at this stage, I would have fully forgotten it. Same thing for you. You talk to these new parents, you're helping them find the right kind of childcare for them. But, it's so interesting when I talk to my friends whose kids are my kids' ages, we don't talk about any of the same things that I talk to the moms at work about. And if I were to talk about these things, they'd be like, what are you talking about? We're past that. We don't need to think about those things anymore. So
we're talking about college now, Linda.
I know. And that's what I'm consumed by. Or like, how do I get my teenage son to be responsible for himself, or whatever, any of those things.
That I wonder the same thing every day.
Exactly. So to answer your question about like the contrast now with so much social media, like sometimes I'm like, wow, I wish I had had that information. But I also at the same time grateful that I didn't, because I see how much anxiety it produces. And all of the comparison, it's bad enough when you're sitting next to your friend and comparing yourself to them and your child to their child in person. But when you have the entire internet telling you that, like, this is how you should be as a mom, or this is how your baby should be doing this or that, I can't imagine how overwhelming that feels. And I see it. I see all the anxiety from that it produces.
Yeah. Or even so, like when you have a new baby and you're laying in bed, like I know for me, when I go to bed and I'm like, oh, I'm going to look at Instagram because this is the time I look at Instagram at night, where I'm sure new parents do that. And when we were new parents, we didn't have that. And so we just were like chill, had a cup of tea, maybe read, maybe not, just maybe passed out. But nowadays you're just consumed with all of that. And then of course, when you are following, new moms or new moms groups or looking at celebrity moms or whatever it is, you are constantly comparing and it's in your face all the time, as opposed to a supportive group, which, exactly what you do.
Right. And so that's why there's just so much value in being in the room with those other moms. And I say to them in that first session, it's really easy to look at somebody else and think to yourself, like, oh, she looks like she has it all together. Like, I think she showered today. It's such a very low bar. But,
or maybe high. I don't know. It depends on the day.
I know. But, it's so easy to look at somebody and make these assumptions. But that's why I say to them, I'm like, come in here with your true self. Talk about how you feel. Talk about what's really going on for you. Talk about the anxiety that you feel with looking at these, people online and the comparisons that we make, because that's what makes it real. And that's what normalizes this experience for other people and helps them feel less alone in it.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think that is great too. And, depending on who you are as a person and whether you have that anxiety or you have postpartum depression or, any of that kind of stuff, then these groups are just nice because then you really just don't feel alone. Because I remember when my kids were little and I was, did stuff through NPN. That's probably how I met you actually. But did all the NPN stuff and did all those meetups and things like that, which were, totally a saving grace. And also living in a big city, it's harder to meet people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And once your kids start going to school, you make friends with like other parents in preschool. So that helps. But when they're really little, that's the way you connect with people. And I love it when there's a mom who, has just moved to Chicago and she'll start the group. And I'm like, this is going to be great for you because now you're going to have like Insta friends, like real life instant friends, not like the internet instant Instagram. But, these are now your people.
Yeah. And they're your people and you have babies the same age. So all the things that you're going through, this new community is going through at the same time, which is
right. And that's the other thing. Like the group it's not just like, 6 weeks and I guess that's all we get. Like I really encourage them to be connected outside of our, time together. And so they set up a WhatsApp group in the first week and that continues for years in many cases that I, when I hear from them.
That's so great. And I feel like too, just amazing for you to feel you created that and you created these friendships. And I feel like that's so rewarding
it's crazy.
Mom.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay. So tell me a little bit about your gentle sleep coaching. So what does that mean? Gentle.
That's a really good question. So first of all, that's Kim's name. That's sort of like the name of her brand that she developed when she was starting to put together her training program. And, her approach really grew out of her work as a therapist. And so she was actually working as a family therapist, working with a lot of toddlers. And what she kind of realized at some point in time was that like a lot of these toddlers are really tired and they're really just not getting enough sleep. And of course that has a huge impact on their behavior. Anybody who lives with a tired toddler knows exactly what I'm talking about. And so, she developed her methodology based on both that experience and also the fact that so much of the other information out there is, put your child in a room and say goodnight, I love you, and leave, or maybe come back and check on them. But none of it was very present with the parent, was where the parent was very present with their child. And so, based on attachment theory and just her experience, actually starting with her own children, she developed her methodology whereby you're staying much more present with your child and, helping them learn how to fall asleep, having that secure base presence in the room. And then gradually over a period of time, you're doing less and less, and you're helping your child adjust to being more independent and not needing your presence. And so that's what her Sleep Lady Shuffle is really about. And so in that training, I think the big thing that I always take away from it, in addition to learning, a new way of working with families, is that you're starting where the family is. And I definitely work with a lot of families who, do not want their child alone in a room by themselves crying. And so now I have the tools to help them with that. But I also work with families who say, you know what, I just need help like straightening out all of the details. We don't actually have a problem with our child crying by themselves, but we need to figure out like, what do we need to adjust? What do we need to change? How do we need to help foster sleep skills? And so the way I think of it is starting where that family is, which is sort of a core, component of being a social worker, is that you're helping your family achieve their goals. Doesn't matter what I think that they should be doing. It's up to them. And so then I'm helping them meet those goals based on what they're comfortable with. And then also my knowledge in terms of what is actually going to work for a child in their circumstances based on their child's age and what their previous experience has been. And so I tell parents all the time, I don't promise that your child won't cry when you start to make changes. Anytime you've done anything to help your child fall asleep at bedtime or back to sleep overnight, and now you say, okay, I'm not going to do things that way anymore, they're going to notice, they're paying attention. Even babies are paying attention. You cannot fool them. And so they're going to notice that, and they're probably going to cry and let you know that they're not happy about it. And so the idea with, responding in more of a gentle way, although I feel like that term is just so loaded now with like gentle parenting and what does that really mean? It's about being responsive, not ignoring them, but also not necessarily doing the thing that your child wants you to do. So if your child's experience is they wake up, you come in, you pick them up, you feed them, maybe you put them back in their sleeping space, or maybe they come and sleep in your bed. And now you say, okay, I'm going to come in there. I'm going to respond to you. I'm going to be present with you, but I'm not going to take you out, and I'm not going to feed you, and I'm not going to put you in my bed. They're going to tell you they're mad about that. And then over a period of several days, when they see, oh, this is all that I can expect. Okay. All right, that's cool. But someone's going to still show up here. All right, good. Then you start to see the behavior change. And so it's about being responsive, but in that response, not giving in and doing the thing that is going to just solve the problem. And, as you know, this is a core principle of parenting for children, all the way through older years. So it applies.
I often tell parents too, it's like if someone's hiring a night care provider, typically like a doula or, a night nanny or whatever, I tell them, I'm like, as parents, we wake up in the night to feed our child, and we're on survival mode here. It's like, feed you, change you, can you go back to bed now? So being able to, and I'm sure that this is part of your program, but being able to stretch some of that out and be like, I'm just not on demand here. Like, I know you don't need to eat, and I know you don't need your diaper changed either, but like a slow progression into better sleep. I'm sure just how long would you say typically takes if someone comes to you and let's say they have a 6-month-old and they're like, okay, well, we just go to our child whenever our child cries and we feed her and we change her diaper. How long does that typically take to change some of that behavior and have some of those boundaries set in place of I'm going to actually do what I know she needs, which is not to eat every 2 hours? What does that look like?
Yeah. So I will say like at 6 months, those babies tend to learn pretty quickly. Usually within like the first 4 to 6 nights, you're going to see pretty big change. I'm always looking at things like feeding very individually. And so may not mean that child isn't fed at night, but we may change how that feeding is happening so that they're not learning, I wake up, I cry, I'm fed, and that's how I go back to sleep. So we're making a plan for how to manage feeding overnight. I'm looking at, well, what is happening during the day? If it's a 6-month-old who's eating every 2 hours, it's likely that child is waking up in the morning and isn't hungry and is probably not actually eating all that well during the day because they're getting all of their calories over the full 24-hour period. And we need to start to kind of redistribute that. But the hard part is that feeding is also often used in order to get them back to sleep, which in the beginning, that works and it works great. And then it stops working. And so parents of a 6-month-old may say to me like, yeah, like at like 2 months old, she started like sleeping 8 hours and she didn't need to eat all of this at night. And all of a sudden, why at 6 months are we waking up every 2 hours? And that's where it's a lot of education about, yeah, that's because at about 4 months, her brain really changed. It went through a big burst of developmental awareness. And now she knows, oh, hey, when I'm going to sleep at bedtime, mommy's feeding me, rocking me, holding me, bouncing me, or daddy, whoever it is. And now when they wake up, they need that help to go back to sleep because of that awareness that they didn't have at 2 months. And so we're changing what's happening at bedtime, helping them develop the skill of falling asleep independently there, which is the key to the whole night. And then having a plan for how to respond consistently throughout the night. So those babies, if parents have not been making multiple attempts at sleep training that they've essentially caved on, then that child is probably going to learn very quickly. The more attempts you make that you then don't follow through with, the harder it is than when I come along and I'm like, okay, we're serious, let's do this. And that baby's like, mommy and daddy, they don't follow through. And that child has learned to become more persistent. So then that can take longer.
Isn't it funny how they're babies and they can just completely know that?
Oh, they're
like,
so smart.
Oh my gosh, yeah, they're like, well, you can't, I know you come when I cry, and therefore I'm going to keep crying because I know you're going to come here. And that's just, you get into that pattern that is probably hard to break too, especially when parents are sleep deprived, when they're like, I just want to get, but that makes total sense. It's nice to have a plan in that way too. Yeah. What would you say, some, like maybe your top 3 common sleep issues? Like when parents call you, what is commonly a topic, like top 3?
Mm-hmm. Well, so it kind of depends, baby versus toddler or older child. Like the most common scenario I'll see for a baby is, they are fed or held or rocked to fall asleep at bedtime. And then throughout the night, those things happen again and again. And then eventually by the early morning, now the parents are like, I can't do this anymore. Just come sleep in my bed. So that's very common for a baby. I would say like 4 months through like 6 or 7 months. I definitely see children in the 8, 9, 10, 11-month range where things were actually going pretty well. And the parents were putting their child in drowsy but awake. And I know that's like such a loaded term because it works well for some children that parents can get them kind of sleepy and they kind of pop their eyes open and then they put them in and then they magically drift off. I never had children who did that. That never worked for them.
Did either. Like, that sounds amazing.
It doesn't, but it's actually not great because then you get to that age where now they can stand up and like, instead of magically drifting off, now their eyes pop open and they're like, no. And they stand straight up and the parents are like, what do we do now? Now you're standing. You can't sleep like this. Children can sleep standing. I've seen it many times, but, so now they're, desperate and then they're taking them out, trying to get them drowsy again, putting them back in. So that'll happen for children as they get a little bit older. I've seen that all the way up through like 18 months, 2 years old. And then there's the other set of children who are like toddler age and they're in a bed. Maybe they're old enough to be in a bed from like a cognitive development standpoint where they have the self-control to keep their body in bed, or maybe they're not even 2.5, or they've just turned 2.5 and they're sort of low on that self-control piece, which is understandable. That's that skill that you need in order to keep your body in bed when you're going to sleep at bedtime. And then if at any point the mood strikes you, you can keep your body in bed again. And that's a very well-developed set of skills. But those are the children where their parents are laying down with them at bedtime because they figure out, well, if I lay down with you, then you at least stay here. And I'm not playing like whack-a-mole to keep you in your room. And so then you're like, okay, that worked. but now they wake up throughout the night because now you're not laying down with them anymore. And so either the parent ends up in their bed, which might be a tiny toddler bed, not good for your
Oh, it's
spine.
terrible. Have you ever heard of a parent getting into a crib?
Oh yeah, for
Oh
sure.
my gosh, it's so weird.
Yeah, many times. I haven't had one in a while, although I did have a family where I worked with them when their daughter was 5 months old, and then this will happen. Like they had all sorts of like toddler issues. So then, we go back and it's a different scenario and we need a different plan. And the mom had started climbing into the crib at bedtime, wasn't staying there until she was asleep, but it was this whole like in the crib, out of the crib. And I was like, nope, no more getting in the crib. It's only for her, the little one.
I feel like you're pretty desperate when you get to that. I mean, I'm not going to lie. When my kids were little, I never did get into the crib, but there were times where I'm like, I literally should just sleep in this crib because I want to sleep and I cannot function throughout the day. And I can see why people are like, maybe that's crazy, but maybe it's a really good idea.
Many parents do it. I mean, I haven't had one that was like a true, like, I'm sleeping in the crib all night scenario, but yeah, I've seen it. So yeah, so the toddler parents, and they're the ones that are just so exhausted and they actually don't have any belief that things are going to change. But really, like toddlers, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, they're incredibly capable of learning new and different things. And I have parents present it in a way that's very kid friendly, that really sets their child up for success and helps them feel like, look at what I did, look at what I've accomplished. And that combination of the parents now being consistent in a way that they weren't before, huge changes. And parents are like, wow, like that takes more like 2 to 3 weeks, but they're like, I can't believe that this is working.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I remember when my kids were little, my first two are 17 months apart, I guess 18 months apart.
So
And
close.
yeah, they're really close. And we were living in Chicago in a 2-bedroom condo. And my son was 18 months and I got him a little toddler bed. And then my daughter was in the crib. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's totally cool. Like they're just going to sleep in the same room and it's going to be awesome. And, all the things. And then my son just would not stay in his bed. I mean, we put up a gate on his door and he would just yell all the night. He'll be like, he had this little dinosaur. He would like throw it over the gate and be like, dropped dino. And he'd like wait for us to come. And it's like, oh my God. So I was going through all of this and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to sleep because I work and I need to work and function during the day. And I was talking to my pediatrician about it. And at the time I didn't even think to call sleep, consultant or anything like that. And she said, how big is your bathroom? And I was like, it's pretty big. She's like, do you have a pack and play? I'm like, yep. I wheeled my daughter into that bathroom for probably a year. And I was just like, put her in the bathroom, like, good night, Maeve. She just slept in my bathroom. And it was like the best ever though, because then the problem was completely gone.
I have a family right now that lives in a 2-bedroom house. It's like a small house and they have a toddler that I worked with them with. And so I just did their consult last week and the baby was in their room, co-sleeping actually on a mattress on the floor. And it was like a whole logistical thing. And I was like, guys have a big closet, a big bathroom? They're like, yep, we have a big bathroom. She is now sleeping through the night in a pack and play in the bathroom. She's doing amazing. And we are going to move her in with her sister. But, I always say like get the baby sleeping first before you put them in. I would also say that your 18-month-old in a bed, that's exactly what I was talking about, is that you don't have any self-control. So he's like, I'm going to get up. I'm going to run over to the gate. I'm going to toss Dino out.
Like constantly, I'm just like, oh my God, I don't know what else to do. But they're pretty smart. They're like, let me see how I can manipulate this situation.
The other one I get is like, cover me, like 300 times a night, where they insist that you come in and pull up their covers. And I'm like, well, let's teach them how to do that for themselves. And then you aren't doing it.
Yep. Then you don't have to do it anymore. Oh my gosh. It just like brings me back. What would you say if a parent came to you and they wanted some advice on the best nighttime routine to start with your baby? Like, what are a couple of things that you're like, these are some musts that you must have this routine to get your baby on a good, I guess, routine before they go to bed?
Yeah. So babies can start to understand a bedtime routine at 8 weeks, really, at the earliest, because that's where they're starting to understand associations between things. But I also feel like 8 weeks is a little bit of a tricky time because you might also be thinking like, well, what is bedtime? And in many cases, bedtime is like whatever time you put on different sweats and turn off the lights and call it bedtime, because it may be midnight, it could be 11, who really knows?
Yeah.
And so sometimes, like, when you say to parents like, oh, you should start doing a bedtime routine at 8 weeks, they're like, oh, okay, well, she said we should do it and this is going to fix all of our problems. And then you're like, oh, wait, but we did the bedtime routine at 8, but you didn't go to bed till 11. Does it not count, or do we have to do it again? So that's one thing I always like to point out. I also feel like routines train us as parents, because routines are important for children. And I actually see it happen a lot with older children that I work with, where parents have stopped doing a routine, and then it actually makes it hard for the child to go to sleep because they haven't had that time to kind of unwind. But the point of your bedtime routine, as your child especially moves past 3 months old, is that knowing what's going to happen, having that predictable rhythm of the evening, actually causes your brain to start producing melatonin, which is that hormone that allows you to fall asleep and stay asleep. And so, that routine, it doesn't have to be long. In fact, I really encourage parents of babies to keep it very brief, because, as you know, since you've survived toddlerhood 3 times, you know that toddlers love to add on to their bedtime routine, and it gets really excessive and really long. So if you can start from a place where it's brief, if it grows, it's okay. You're not looking at like an hour, or more. So the basics of a bedtime routine for a baby in the really early stages are: you maybe give them a bath, maybe not, because they aren't really playing in the sandbox, so they're not really so dirty at that point.
Just the milk neck rolls.
Oh God, you just like, it's a wipe down. I know they got kind of stinky in there.
Yeah.
But you change their diaper, put on different jammies. Maybe you try to read a book. At some point, they're so tired, they're trying to eat the book. They're trying to hid it away. They may not be in the book. Maybe there's a song that you want to associate with bedtime routine and have them know, okay, this means it's time to go to sleep. And then for a very young baby, the feeding is at the end. Once you're in kind of sleep training timing and you're changing feeding and sleeping association and helping that child go to sleep on their own, I always have parents move the feeding to the beginning of the bedtime routine to disassociate feeding and sleeping and make sure they're wide awake at that point. But there's usually a feeding at some point in there someplace.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, that's all it is.
That's great. I remember, I haven't thought about this in forever, but I used to play a CD for my kids, and it was like a sleep something CD that I had gotten. And I was very consistent with it. It was every single night. And once I started playing that, my kids were like, okay, like we know what to expect next and we know what's going on here. And I felt like that was really kind of helpful.
Yeah. Now there are, playlists on Spotify you can just use. You don't need a CD.
Yeah, it's funny that I'm going way back to a CD, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you were to tell us your top 3 tips of getting your baby to sleep through the night, and I know it's just going to depend because they're all ages here, but if you were to give if anyone would ask you your top 3 tips of successful sleeping through the night, what would those be?
Well, the key to the entire night for children, especially once they're moving past 4 months, is that they have to have fallen asleep independently at bedtime. That doesn't mean super drowsy. That means that they are 100% awake and they are going into their sleeping space in that way, and they are learning how to get themselves 100% asleep. So that's huge. 80% of all children will then actually sleep through if they've fallen asleep independently at bedtime. The other piece then, so I would say number 2, is having a way of responding to them that's going to be very consistent and predictable so that they can get themselves back to sleep each and every time they wake up and they know what to expect from you. I would say beyond that, thinking about how you're managing feeding, but also kind of a close tie with that is making sure you and your partner are on the same page with regard to what you're going to be doing, because there's no good time to have an argument with your partner, but 2 a.m. is a very bad time for that to happen, especially in the midst of trying to make changes and everyone feeling frustrated. And I get the non-nursing parent very involved if it's a situation where a baby expects to be fed overnight. And so that may mean that the parent who hasn't really had to do very much at night now needs to step in and take a much more active role. And so making sure that they're on board with that so that everyone is going to be consistent from there.
Well, that's really good advice too, to talk about that, communication and being on the same page, because you wouldn't think when you're thinking about sleep and your baby, that's not really something you think about, but that is so important, because if you're lacking sleep and your partner's lacking sleep, and it's just going to be a hot mess unless you guys are sort of in alignment.
Aligned. Yeah. I mean, I always think of it, first of all, when I do consultations with parents, in most cases, I ask that both parents are there. And that's just because I want to make sure everyone's hearing everything coming directly from me. It always goes over better coming from me than it does sometimes from your partner. But this is sometimes one of the first big parenting decisions that parents are figuring out how to make together, and figuring out, well, what do I feel? What do you feel? What are we going to be able to kind of come to agreement on? And then everybody is participating in this process. Sometimes you haven't actually had to work together in that way quite yet. And you may have even been sort of like ships in the night up until this point, especially if parents are doing a lot of taking shifts. And so now this is really where I'm saying, like, no, I need you, let's be honest, dad, who hasn't done very much at night, to be very involved. And I had it happen very recently where in a history form, it said, my husband isn't really interested in participating at night. He can't. His job is very busy. He has to be awake early. And so I kind of went into it knowing what the scenario was. And the very first thing I said was, I really need you involved. We're going to need your help. This is a 20-month-old who has been nursing all night long for virtually his whole life. And we're really going to need your help. I don't need it forever. I need like a couple weeks of this and that. And can you be on board with it? And he was like, yeah, I can do that. And he was amazing.
That's so awesome. Do you ever feel like you're like a marriage therapist?
Yes.
I do too sometimes.
And that's where, yeah, I'm sure you do. That's where like my background as a social worker and just knowing how to talk to parents in a way that they're going to be receptive really comes in handy, because I know how to say things in a way that parents are going to think of it as like, oh, okay, this is going to help me, and not you're judging me, you're blaming me. Nobody responds to that.
Yes, that is definitely so true. What would you say? I just had this vision of when my kids were little, laying in their crib, and I had like 30 pacifiers in their crib so that they could find them, so they wouldn't need me. What are would you say your top tips for like don'ts? Like, this is a hard no, do not do this.
I mean, honestly, as long as it's not something that's unsafe, especially in the first, up till even 6 months. I mean, I think the big thing to just hear is that there is nothing you're going to do in the beginning that's going to cause a long-term problem. And I think that's really important to say out loud, because moms are reading that. Like, oh, I had somebody just say to me the other day, I read that by 12 weeks, my child has already started to form habits that are not going to be changeable. Absolutely not.
Well,
I feel so badly when I hear that, and I'm like, where did you hear that? Can I make it go away? So, there's nothing you're going to do in those early months that is unchangeable. Children are so capable of learning all sorts of new and different things. And in the beginning, there's so much that they need your help with. So if that means that a pacifier helps them go to sleep, then you're going to give them a pacifier. If that means that they need to be swaddled beyond 8 weeks, then you're going to keep swaddling them beyond 8 weeks, because they're still startling. And from a physiological standpoint, they can't really stay asleep on their back without that pressure. So they're getting so many messages about these things, but you have to tune into what is happening with your child, but beyond that, it's, if they're doing things that are safe, then it's fine. As they get older, there are things that you may want to change, just because, again, it creates inconsistency. So that comes to when you're talking about the pacifier, I don't think pacifiers are bad. I don't think they're evil in any way. I think that for a 4-month-old that you're helping learn how to be independent, they don't have the fine motor coordination to pick up a passy and put it in their mouth. And so that's where I'll say, let's get rid of it at night. You can keep it for naps, but let's get rid of it at bedtime. You're not giving to them then. You're not giving to them overnight. Within 2 to 3 days, they don't know that they had it, and they're actually sleeping so much better. So it also solves your problem to get rid of it. But everything is changeable.
Yeah, that's so true. How often, just out of curiosity, how often do you find yourself needing to talk to parents and say, okay, let me reiterate this again. We need to follow X, Y, and Z. And they're just not, they're like, oh, I tried, but I really just had to do that. Like, is that a common pain point in your business?
Less now than it was when I first started. I mean, I just feel, and you've had your business for probably about as long as I have. How long have you been doing
20
this?
years.
Okay, so you're longer even, and you think back to like maybe how you would have talked to families in those first few years, and you're like, I'm just going to fake it till I make it kind of thing.
100%.
Yeah. And now I know what to look for. I know where, like when I talk to a family and I'm like, yep, this is going to be an issue. This is what I need to say to them so that they're going to hear this. And maybe I need to keep repeating it to them. So sure, there are here and there are nights where I'm like, okay, you know what? That wasn't great. Remember we talked about not doing that. Remember I told you that, we might have to have this intermittent reinforcement conversation again. Well, here we are saying that again. And now this is why you're seeing X, Y, or Z happen. And remember in our initial consultation, I talked about why this would cause this to happen. And so then they're like, okay, yeah, you're right. And then they get on board, but usually they're starting to see improvement. So they know like, okay, I know why I need to do this. And always I'm kind of echoing to them like, yeah, this is really hard. You're really tired. And I totally understand this, but this is what we're doing to help everybody not be tired so that this doesn't become a long-term problem. I will say there are definitely also, incidents where I work with families where I'm like, this isn't getting better. Why isn't this changing? You're doing all the things that my experience tells me is going to improve the situation. And what else is happening here? And sometimes it's because there are underlying medical issues. And those are things that I screen for. But in some cases, those are hard to pick out when there's so many other behavioral issues that are complicating things. And so as the behavioral piece starts to kind of shake out, parents are being consistent, then I'm like, what's going on here? And then I start asking a lot of different questions. And sometimes it means, you know what, let's get you in to see an ear, nose, and throat doctor. Like there could be a sleep apnea concern here. Let's get you back to the pediatrician and talk to them about the things that cause children to have what's known as restless leg syndrome, which is usually related to having low levels of ferritin in their blood. Will they do a blood draw? Can we explain how like there are these studies out there that show this? Can you bring them the journal articles? So I'm also helping parents advocate for their child with other providers based on what they've learned from us working together and now knowing like we need to look at some other avenues here.
Yep. And that goes so well above and beyond what, somebody initially calling you would ever really expect. But I think it's your background of being a social worker where you're like, I can provide all of these other things. And I would imagine too, that even when you're talking to new moms or even in your new moms group where you're like, if you see signs, given your background of being a social worker, if you see signs of postpartum anxiety or depression or anything like that, you're like, I know what to look for here. And I'm sure that is really helpful for everyone in your group or your parents that you work with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as far as that goes, I mean, every mom who participates in the group, they fill out a registration form ahead of time. So I'm screening them. And it's amazing how far I think it goes to just ask the question, beyond filling out the Edinburgh postpartum depression screening at your 6-week checkup, but to say, how are you feeling emotionally? How are you feeling about your bonding with your baby? How are you feeling about the experience of leaving your house with your baby? Where is anxiety kind of starting to creep up? And moms will list it on there and they may not have told anybody else. And so then my response when I see that is, hey, thank you for sharing this with me. There are amazing providers at least in Chicago, that I refer to regularly. I just ask them, what kind of health insurance do you have? And I send them directly to perinatal providers who already are experts at working with postpartum moms. And so now they're getting directly to the help they need yes, sometimes they talk to their OB, but sometimes that doesn't go so well, and their doctor may minimize some of those concerns or whatever it is. So that gives me an opening to put them in the right spot.
Yep, definitely. Well, that's awesome. Well, I feel like you're so helpful on all topics, not just sleep, but just, new mom related and just being an expert. And like you said, you've been doing what you've been doing for so long that you do become an expert, and you see so many different, moms and different struggles and all the things that you're just learning constantly as you go. And I love that. I love your new moms group too, because I just think having those relationships, and especially for long term, and I think that's just so great. I wish I would have had that when I was, a new mom, because I didn't really have any of that stuff. And it was kind of, I waited until my kids were in preschool. And then I started, like you said, when your kids go to school, you start meeting new people. That's kind of when I started meeting new people, so
right.
I love that. It's
but
amazing.
All of these transition points are points in your life where you realize oh, okay, these are my new people, because sometimes your people from before no longer fit in your world.
Yeah. Your old people want to go get beers.
Right. Or they don't invite you. They don't invite you to go get beers. Yeah. I know.
They don't even want your baby around. They're like, no, that person's a drain.
That just came up in my second time moms group yesterday. Mom was saying how they had coffee with some friends, and so they got her baby is literally 6 weeks old. I mean, she just sleeps the whole time. And they walk in, and the couple was like, "Oh, you brought the baby?" And she was like, "1, she's just going to sleep the whole time, and 2, what did you think I was going to do with her?
And don't you want to see my baby?" I think you should have another moms group for the third time mom, because that would be really funny to see the difference and compare. I'd love to have the first time moms hang out with the third time moms, where it's like their kids are just, who knows where their kids are. They're like, we're fine. They're somewhere around here. As long as they're breathing, we're all good.
Right. Oh, it's totally different. My very close friend has 4 kids, and she's always like, I don't know where that 4th one is. What's she doing?
Yeah, you just kind of don't know. You lose track after a while. As long as I always tell everyone, as long as they're all breathing in somewhere, I think we're good. Well, awesome. Well, Linda, this was such an awesome interview with you, and I feel like I learned a lot. It definitely brought me back to memory lane. But if you want to sort of end this, let the audience know where they can find you, and how to reach out, both for the New Moms Group and for the sleep consulting.
Mm-hmm. So the New Moms Group, you can find it's on the website. At the website, it's chicagonewmomsgroup.com. And for my sleep consulting, it's sleeptightconsultants.com. You can both register for a group that way. You can sign up for a free initial call for an initial consultation that way. You can always email me at either of those places as well through the website.
Perfect. And also I wanted to add to that, Linda has an awesome podcast, which goes through tons of different topics, and there's tons of conversations that are super informative.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's called the Sleepy Cues podcast. So you can find that wherever you find podcasts.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Linda. We appreciate having you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.